The horror did not strike all at once. It came slowly, creeping through the streets, thickening the air until it strangled the breath from London's lungs. It slithered through open windows, seeped into grand buildings, and settled into the bones of the city itself. By the summer of 1858, the capital of the British Empire, the wealthiest, most powerful city in the world, was suffocating under the weight of its own filth. It was not war, nor fire, nor famine that brought London to its knees. It was something far worse. The Great Stink, they called it, a name that barely scratched the surface of the horror that had overtaken the city. The Thames, once the pride of London, had become a monstrous, rotting corpse of a river. A sluggish, heaving mass of excrement, industrial runoff, and decaying flesh, its surface bloated with the carcasses of dogs, cats, and even the occasional human body. The heat wave that gripped the city in an unrelenting vice only made things worse, baking the refuse until it festered and thickened the very air with its poison. The people of London had lived with filth for centuries, but this was different. This was something they could no longer ignore. London in the 19th century was a city of staggering contrasts, unimaginable wealth and power built on the backs of the poor who lived in squalor. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the city into the beating heart of the world, a place of progress, innovation, and industry. But it had also turned it into a festering pit of disease and decay. The problem had been growing for decades. The population had exploded, doubling in size in just 50 years, from 1 million in 1800 to more than 2 million by the middle of the century. With no proper sewage system, waste had to go somewhere. And that somewhere was the Thames. The river had become the city's dumping ground. Human waste from overflowing cesspits, rotting animal carcasses from butcher shops, chemical waste from factories, blood from slaughterhouses. All of it was dumped into the water, day after day, year after year. And the people drank from it. The very river that carried away the city's waste was also its main source of drinking water. The link between contaminated water and disease was not yet widely understood, though some doctors, like John Snow, had begun to suspect the connection, but most still clung to the old belief that sickness came from miasma, or bad air. The summer of 1858 was about to prove them both right. The heat came in early June. It was relentless, an oppressive, merciless sun that turned the cobbled streets into furnaces and the stagnant river into something far worse. Day after day, the temperature climbed. The Thames slowed, its currents no longer strong enough to carry away the filth that choked it. The waste that had once been carried downriver now lingered, thickening, putrefying, turning the once mighty river into a living corpse. Then the smell came. At first, it was just an unpleasant odor hanging over the water, something Londoners could wrinkle their noses at and dismiss. But as the days wore on, it became something else, something that could not be ignored. It crept into homes, settled in alleyways, filled the lungs of anyone who dared to venture outside. It was the stench of death, not metaphorical death, but real, tangible decay, an overwhelming, inescapable miasma that sent people reeling, retching in the streets. The newspapers called it unbearable. Priests said it was a punishment from God. Physicians feared the air itself had turned lethal. The people of London, from the slums to the aristocracy, covered their faces with vinegar-soaked cloths, burned herbs in their homes, doused the streets with lime in a futile attempt to drive the horror away. Nothing worked. The stench had become a living thing, wrapping its tendrils around the city and squeezing the breath from its people. And then the cholera came. The disease had been a silent killer in London before. Outbreaks had swept through the city in waves, terrible but common. But this time, something was different. This time, the deaths came in staggering numbers. Families woke to find their children dead in their beds, their bodies twisted in agony. Streets emptied as entire neighborhoods were wiped out overnight. The poor were hit first, their overcrowded tenements and shared water sources making them easy prey. But soon the disease began creeping into wealthier districts, and with every glass of water, every sip from the contaminated Thames, the death toll climbed higher. Bodies piled up in graveyards already overflowing. The city's churchyards, packed beyond capacity, had long since run out of space. The dead were crammed into shallow pits, barely covered with soil before the next bodies arrived. The smell of rot mixed with the reek of the river, turning London into something barely recognizable. And yet, the government did nothing. For years, the lawmakers of Westminster had ignored the crisis of the Thames. They had dismissed reports, rejected proposals, scoffed at the pleas of the poor, who had no choice but to live beside the filth. The Thames was a problem for other people, until it came for them. By mid-July, the stench had reached the very halls of Parliament. The air inside the Palace of Westminster was thick with the sickly sweet odor of decay. Lords and MPs gagged as they entered the chamber, some pressing perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, others retching openly. They tried everything. They ordered the curtains soaked in lime and chloride to mask the smell. They attempted to ventilate the chambers with hastily rigged systems. Nothing worked. The great stink had breached the walls of power. Faced with the unbearable reality of what London had become, Parliament finally broke. Sessions were suspended. Laws went unpassed. The government, helpless against the sheer force of the stench, fled. It was only then, with their own comfort under threat, that the lawmakers acted. Sir Joseph Bazalgette had been waiting for this moment. For years, he had proposed a grand plan, an underground sewer system that would divert the city's waste far from the Thames. But his proposals had been dismissed, seen as too expensive, too ambitious. Now, with Parliament itself on the verge of collapse, his time had come. His plan was vast, revolutionary, a network of sewers that would stretch for miles, redirecting waste away from the city, transforming London's approach to sanitation forever. The work was dangerous, costly, but essential. Over the next 2 decades, Bazalgette's sewers took shape, brick by brick, tunnel by tunnel, and slowly the Thames began to heal. The water cleared, the stench faded, the deaths subsided. London at last had been saved from itself, but cities forget. The great stink became a legend, something to be laughed at in history books, a strange tale of a time when London nearly collapsed under its own waste. Yet even now, the river is not as clean as it seems. The burden on Bazalgette's system has grown. The population has swelled once more. The water, though clearer than in 1858, still carries the weight of millions of lives, millions of choices. And so the Thames flows on, silent and patient, waiting. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing content.